Good evening, night creatures. Tonight we learn about the next Titan, the Mother of Gods, Rhea. Prologue. The woman in the middle of everything. She is not usually the story. In the great mythological narratives that the Greek tradition preserved and transmitted, Rhea appears most often as a function rather than a person. The mother of the Olympians, the wife of Cronus, the one who hid the infant Zeus on Crete and presented a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes to a husband who would swallow it without examining what he held. She is the hinge between two divine ages, the figure through whom the Titans became the parents of the Olympians, the woman whose single successful deception changed the structure of the cosmos. And then, in most tellings, she steps back. The story moves to Zeus, to the Titanomachy, to the establishment of Olympus and the distribution of divine domains, and all the subsequent drama of the mythology's most familiar episodes. Rhea is present in these accounts mainly as background, the mother who watches, the grandmother who occasionally intervenes, the ancient figure of the Great Mother, who persists through successive divine generations without ever quite becoming the protagonist of the narrative she has done so much to make possible. This backgrounding is, on examination, a profound distortion of what the mythology actually contains. Rhea's role in the ancient Greek religious imagination was not secondary. She was one of the most widely worshipped of all divine figures across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Her cult, particularly in its developed forms in Crete and in the broader tradition of the Anatolian Great Mother, with whom she was repeatedly identified, was among the oldest and most geographically extensive divine cults in the ancient world. She was worshipped with drums and ecstatic dance, with lion imagery and mountain symbolism, with the kind of fervent religious devotion that the more civilized Olympian cults sometimes acknowledged, but could not fully contain. She is the mother of Hestia and Demeter, and Hera, and Hades, and Poseidon, and Zeus. Every Olympian who matters to the subsequent mythology, and many who do not fit neatly into the Olympian category, but belong to the broader family, came through her. The generation that would govern the cosmos in the age that mattered most to the human beings who told and preserved these myths was her generation, was her production, was the children she carried and labored to bring into the world, and then worked with extraordinary patience and cunning to protect from the husband who was destroying them. She is also, in the philosophical and theological imagination of the ancient world, something far larger than any specific mythological narrative contains. She is the Great Mother, the Mother of the Gods, the Magna Mater, the primordial feminine principle from which all divine life descends. In this capacity, she is not a character in stories so much as the condition from which all the stories become possible, the generative principle, the nurturing force, the mother not only of her 6 specific children, but of the divine world as such. To tell her story properly requires both scales, the specific and the cosmic, the woman with a stone in her hands facing her husband's terrifying hunger, and the primordial Great Mother from whom all divine life springs. It requires following her through the mythology she inhabits, understanding the religious traditions that honored her across centuries and cultures, and recognizing in both the specific narrative and the broader symbolic resonance the same essential quality, a mother's fierce, patient, inexhaustible love, and the extraordinary lengths that love will go to in order to protect what it has produced. She is the mother of gods. This story is hers. Book 1, The Titan Queen, Part 1, Origins and Marriage. Chapter 1, The Daughter of Sky and Earth. She was the daughter of Uranus and Gaia, of the sky and the earth, the first great cosmic pairing, the union of the covering above and the generative surface below. She was born into the first generation of divine beings that were truly specific, truly named, truly individual, in a way that the primordials, vast and diffuse, were not. The Titans were the children of sky and earth. They were, in the deepest mythological understanding, the principles of the world given divine form. Not arbitrary characters assigned arbitrary domains, but the fundamental forces and qualities of the cosmos, shaped into beings who could relate to each other, conflict with each other, and through their relations and conflicts, generate the subsequent history of the divine world. Rhea was one of these fundamental principles. The mythology paired her with Cronus in the royal couple that would govern the Titan Age. But before this pairing, before her marriage and its devastating consequences and her eventual resistance, she was simply herself, the daughter of sky and earth, the feminine principle associated with the earth's generative abundance, the goddess who carried within her nature something of both her parents, the sky's encompassing embrace and the earth's inexhaustible fertility. She was, in the oldest and broadest understanding of her divine nature, a goddess of the earth, not Gaia, who was the earth itself, the literal ground, the geological and biological totality of the planet as a divine being. Rhea was the earth in a different register, the earth as the productive and the nurturing, the earth as the mother who generates and sustains, rather than the earth as the ground beneath one's feet. She was the Mother Earth in the sense of the mother who was earthly, embodied, fertile, present, generating life not as an abstract cosmic function, but as the specific experienced work of carrying and bearing and nursing and protecting. This distinction between Gaia and Rhea, between the earth as cosmic foundation and the earth as nurturing mother, would become increasingly important as the tradition developed both figures and found that their differences were as significant as their similarities. They were related, overlapping, the grandmother and the mother in the divine genealogy, but they were not identical, and the difference between them was precisely the difference between the cosmic and the personal scale of the same fundamental principle. Chapter 2, Identification with the Wider World. Before entering the specific narrative of her marriage and its consequences, it is essential to understand that Rhea's divine identity was not limited to the specific Greek tradition of the Titans and the Olympians. She was part of a much broader religious phenomenon that extended across the ancient Near East, Anatolia, the Mediterranean, and beyond, a phenomenon that modern scholars call the Great Mother Tradition, the worship of a supreme feminine divine principle of generation and nurturing that appeared, with local variations, in virtually every ancient culture in the region. The Anatolian goddess Cybele, the Phrygian mountain mother worshipped on Mount Dindymus and throughout the highlands of what is now Turkey. was identified with Rhea by the Greeks who encountered her worship, recognizing in this goddess's lion throne, her wild mountain dwelling, her ecstatic cult of drums and dance and sacred priests, something that resonated profoundly with their own understanding of what Rhea was and represented. This identification was not merely the Greeks imposing their own categories onto foreign material. The structural and symbolic similarities between Cybele and Rhea were genuine and extensive. Both were mothers of the gods. Both were associated with mountains and wild nature. Both were honored with ecstatic religious practices that involved drums and cymbals, and the kind of intense, physically expressive worship that stood in contrast to the more measured, formal worship of the more civilized Olympian gods. Both were depicted with lions, either seated on a lion throne or attended by lions, the most powerful and sovereign of the wild animals, expressing through this association the divine authority of the Great Mother, who ruled even over the fiercest of natural forces. This broader resonance meant that Rhea's religious significance in the ancient world was not limited to her role in the specifically Greek mythological narrative. She was part of something much older and much more widely distributed, a fundamental religious impulse toward honoring the generative and nurturing feminine, expressed in the specific vocabulary of the Greek Titan tradition, but drawing on wells of religious imagination that extended far beyond that tradition's specific cultural and historical boundaries. Understanding Rhea with this broader context in mind changes how we read her specific narrative. She was not simply a character in a Greek myth who happened to be associated with certain symbols and cult practices. She was the Greek face of a religious reality that the ancient world experienced and honored in many forms, and the specific episodes of her mythological story, the marriages, the swallowings, the deceptions, the protections, were understood in the context of this larger divine identity that made her significance impossible to reduce to any single narrative episode. Chapter 3. The marriage to Cronus. She married her brother. This is the fact that the Greek tradition recorded, and the fact that requires the same kind of contextual understanding that applies to all Titan marriages. In the primordial divine generation, the categories of kinship and marriage were not yet organized by the social prohibitions that would govern both divine and mortal behavior in subsequent ages. The Titans married among themselves because there were only Titans, only the generation of their own parents' children, and the mythology treated these marriages not as violations of taboo, but as the appropriate unions of complementary cosmic principles. Rhea and Cronus were complementary in the way that the mythology paired its Titan couples. She, the generative earth principle, he, the Titan associated with the harvest and with time, the one who cut down the mature crop, and who would prove, in devastating ways, willing to cut down his own children as well. The sickle that Cronus used against his father was an agricultural tool before it was a weapon, and the agricultural domain that Cronus would come to represent, the harvest, the cutting, the claiming of what has grown, stood in both complement and tension with Rhea's generative abundance. The mythology does not dwell extensively on the early period of their marriage, on the relationship that preceded the crisis of the swallowings, on what Rhea might have known or felt about her husband before the repeated devastating pattern began to emerge. What it preserves, with considerable clarity, is the outcome of the marriage. They ruled together over the Titan Age. They were the royal couple of the divine generation that governed the cosmos before the Olympians. And then, immediately, in the compressed narrative time of the mythological account, the problem began. But the mythology's narrative compression does not require us to imagine that no relationship preceded the problem. The Rhea, who eventually found the courage and cunning to deceive her husband and protect her sixth child, was not a figure who had been in opposition to Cronus from the beginning. She was someone who had shared governance with him, who had presumably experienced the golden age of his early reign. That period the tradition remembered as a time of peace and abundance, and who had then watched him become something terrifying, something that required resistance rather than partnership, something whose fear had transformed him from the king of a golden age into the destroyer of everything she produced. This transformation, from the partner of the golden age to the husband whose fear required active resistance, was the arc of Rhea's relationship with Cronus, and it matters as the background to the specific acts of resistance that would define her mythological role. Chapter 4: The World Under the Titans. Before the crisis, there was the kingdom. The Titan Age was the period of the world's governance by the divine generation that Rhea herself belonged to. And to understand what Rhea was and represented during this period requires understanding something of what this governance entailed. The Titans were not primarily understood, in the mythology, as benevolent rulers overseeing a harmonious world, though the specific memory of Cronus's golden age, discussed in the context of his myth, preserved a tradition that at least his early reign had been characterized by abundance and peace. The Titans were the divine generation of forces, vast, elemental, cosmic, rather than personal, in the way the Olympians would later become. They were the principles of the world, rather than the governors of specific domains, in the way that Zeus would govern the sky, Poseidon the sea, Demeter the grain. Rhea's role in this generation was the most fundamental of all feminine roles. She was the mother, not yet the mother who had borne her divine children and seen them grown and active in the world. They were still being born, still being swallowed, still absent from the world in the most devastating way possible. She was the mother in the sense of the inexhaustible generative principle, the one from whom the next generation was coming, the one who carried within her the future that her husband feared. This is the deepest structural position in the entire mythological sequence. Rhea was simultaneously the king's queen, the partner of Cronus in the governance of the Titan Age, and the carrier of the very force that would end the Titan Age. She contained, quite literally in her pregnancies, the children who would eventually overthrow the order she and Cronus jointly represented. She was the hinge between the ages, not merely as a genealogical fact, but as a living tension, the mother whose love for her children could not be reconciled with her husband's fear of those same children. The woman in whom the contradiction between the old order and the new was most immediately and personally experienced. She was the site of the contradiction. The tension that the Titanomachy would eventually resolve through cosmic violence was for the years of her marriage to Cronus and her repeated pregnancies, primarily experienced by Rhea, in her body, in her grief, in the choice that she eventually made to resist. Part 2. The Swallowings. Chapter 5. The First Loss. When Hestia was born, the firstborn of Rhea and Cronus, the one who would eventually become the goddess of the hearth, the sacred fire that scented every home, Cronus took her and swallowed her. The mythology presents this boldly, without extended description of the surrounding experience. Hestia was born. Cronus swallowed her. The narrative moves on. But the experience of this from Rhea's perspective, the perspective that the myth consistently acknowledges only partially, through her later actions rather than through extended attention to her interiority, was not something that could be passed over so quickly. She had carried this child. She had labored to bring this child into the world. She had seen the first child she bore, the beginning of our divine motherhood, taken immediately by the husband who should have been this child's father and protector, and consumed. The grief of this moment was not the grief of death, not the grief that the loss of a child to illness or violence would produce, devastating as that grief is. It was something stranger and in some ways more unbearable. She had not lost Hestia to death. She had lost Hestia to a suspension, an existence within non-existence, a state in which the child continued to live, but lived in the most restricted possible sense, inside her father's body, denied the world, and denied development, and denied the chance to be what she was meant to become. This quality of loss, not death, but indefinite suspended non-existence, not the finality of grief's conclusion, but an ongoing absence without the consolation of closure, would be repeated through 4 subsequent children: Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. 5 children, 5 pregnancies, 5 moments of birth, followed immediately by swallowing, each one a repetition of the first devastating pattern, each one adding another layer of grief to what Rhea was carrying alongside, whatever new pregnancy was already beginning. This was not the experience of the mythological narrative, which compresses the sequence into a brief catalogue. This was years, in whatever timescale the divine age operated, years of repeated pregnancy, labor, birth, and loss, with no end in sight and no recourse available, and no one to whom she could appeal, except her own mother, the earth itself, whose counsel would eventually provide the way out. Chapter 6. 5 times. The mythology lists them: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. 5 children swallowed, 5 repetitions of the same devastating pattern. The repetition itself is significant. The first swallowing might, the mythology's psychology suggests might, not does, have been responded to by Rhea with shock, disbelief, the hope that this was an aberration rather than a policy. The second swallowing would have destroyed that hope. By the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, the pattern was established beyond any possibility of surprise, and what Rhea was experiencing was the grinding, repetitive grief of knowing exactly what was coming and being unable to prevent it. She could not prevent it. This is a crucial element of the experience that the mythology's compressed account can cause us to miss. Rhea was not passive by choice during the years of the swallowings. She was constrained. She was the wife of the most powerful divine being in the cosmos. the one who had overthrown Uranos himself, who had demonstrated at the founding moment of his reign a willingness to do what needed to be done, regardless of the violence required. She had no allies against him. The other Titans, whatever private sympathies they might have held, were not the kind of allies who could be recruited for opposition to the Titan King without enormous risk. Her own mother, Gaia, was a potential ally, but a complex one, having helped create the situation through her own initial empowerment of Cronus against Uranos. The space for action was extremely limited, and the risk of premature or unsuccessful action, which might result in worse consequences than patient endurance, was real. Whatever Rhea was planning or considering through those years of loss, she was planning and considering in the context of genuine powerlessness, of a situation in which the wrong move at the wrong time could destroy the possibility of the eventual right move. This patient endurance, not passive acceptance but active, calculating endurance, suffering what could not yet be resisted in order to be in a position to resist when the moment finally came, was itself a profound demonstration of something essential in Rhea's character, a capacity for the long view, for holding both the immediate pain and the eventual possibility simultaneously, without the immediate pain collapsing into either despair or premature action. Chapter 7. What she was doing during those years. The mythology does not record what Rhea was doing, feeling, planning, or experiencing during the years between the first swallowing and the eventual deception that saved Zeus. The ancient sources were not primarily interested in her interior life, in the psychological texture of her experience during those years of repeated loss and constrained inaction. But the what she was doing question is not unanswerable from the evidence the mythology provides. She was watching, she was learning, she was understanding, with the specific hard knowledge that repeated experience provides, exactly how her husband operated, exactly what triggered his fear and drove his response, exactly where the vulnerability in his method lay. Cronus swallowed his children. This meant he had to be presented with what appeared to be a child to swallow. He was responding to a perceived stimulus, the birth of a child, the potential fulfillment of the prophecy that threatened his position, in a way that was reflexive, established, perhaps even, in the devastating irony of the repeatedly enacted fear, routine. Routines have vulnerabilities. Reflexive responses can be manipulated. The very certainty of his method, the predictability that came from having done this 5 times, with no resistance, no deception, no reason to examine what he was swallowing closely, was the vulnerability that Rhea had 5 children's worth of grief and observation to identify. She had watched him swallow Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. She had seen what the process looked like, what he expected, what information he used to verify that the thing presented to him was the child he feared. She had learned, through the accumulation of loss, that was also the accumulation of knowledge, exactly what she would need to do differently when the opportunity came. She was also cultivating the relationship with her mother that would eventually provide the crucial counsel and support. Gaia, the grandmother of the swallowed children, had her own reasons to want the pattern broken and her own access to the deep earth knowledge that had enabled her to plan and execute the overthrow of Uranos. the alliance between Rhea and Gaia, the mother and the grandmother, the two great feminine principles of the earth working together, would be the foundation of the plan that eventually saved Zeus. Chapter 8. The Approach to Gaia. When Rhea was pregnant for the 6th time, carrying the child who would become Zeus, she finally did what the accumulated grief of 5 losses had been building toward. She went to her mother. She went to Gaia and to Uranos, in some versions, to the deepest sources of divine wisdom and prophetic knowledge available to her, and she asked them what she could do. The request was specific. How could she bear and conceal this child? How could she give birth to a son who would punish his cruel father and restore what had been wrongfully taken from the world? The 5 swallowed children, denied their right to exist and develop and become what they were meant to become. Gaia's counsel was equally specific. Go to Crete, the island that was in many traditions the most ancient of sacred places, the birthplace of the most ancient divine worship. Go there to give birth, in the mountains, in the hidden places where the earth's own protective power was most concentrated. And when the time comes to present the newborn to Cronus, present not the actual child, but a stone wrapped and disguised to resemble an infant, to satisfy his expectation without delivering to him what he actually feared. The plan was simple in its outline and complex in its requirements. Simple because deception, in principle, did not require elaborate mechanisms. It required only that Cronus's expectations be managed successfully. Complex because managing those expectations required getting everything right. The timing, the disguise, the concealment of the actual infant, the establishment of protective care for the hidden child across whatever span of time would be necessary for him to grow to the maturity required to challenge his father. Rhea went to Crete. Book 2. The Protection. Part 3. Crete and the Birth of Zeus. Chapter 9. The Sacred Island. Crete was not an arbitrary choice of location for the divine birth. It was the center of one of the oldest religious traditions in the Aegean world, a tradition that predated Greek civilization as such, that reached back into the Minoan culture that had flourished on the island for millennia before the Greek-speaking peoples arrived in the region. In the Greek religious imagination, Crete was the primordial sacred island, the place where the oldest divine truths were preserved, where the connection to the most ancient layers of religious experience was still alive in ways that might no longer be accessible on the mainland. The story of Zeus's birth on Crete was not merely a geographical detail, but a theological claim. This was where the most fundamental of all divine births happened, in the most sacred of all places, the island that the earth itself had prepared as the most protected and most consecrated location for the event that would change the structure of the cosmos. The specific locations on Crete associated with Zeus's birth varied across different traditions. Mount Ida and Mount Dicte were the primary candidates, each with its own cave associated with the infant's concealment, each with its own religious tradition of worship that extended back into antiquity, far deeper than the surviving written sources. These caves were not merely geological features. They were sacred spaces, places where the boundary between the human world and the divine was understood to be particularly thin, where the earth's own holiness concentrated itself in the darkness and the enclosure that a cave provided. Rhea came to this island, to these mountains and these caves, to give birth in the most protected and most sacred space available to her. The earth received her. The cave enclosed the birth. And when Zeus was born, he was immediately secreted away into this hidden, protected space, away from his father's knowledge, in the keeping of those who would protect and raise him through the years of his concealed development. Chapter 10. The Protectors of the Infant. The mythology gave Zeus various protectors during his hidden childhood on Crete, and the variations across different accounts of who these protectors were reflects the rich diversity of local religious traditions that contributed to the overall picture of the divine infant's early life. Amalthea was one of the most beloved of these figures, the goat who nursed the infant Zeus, whose milk sustained the future king of the gods through his vulnerable early years. In some accounts, Amalthea was a goat. In others, she was a nymph who kept a sacred goat, whose milk she gave to the child. The horn of Amalthea, broken off accidentally and later becoming the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, the symbol of inexhaustible divine abundance, was one of the most enduring mythological symbols to emerge from this period of Zeus's concealment, a reminder that divine abundance and divine protection were inseparable in the tradition's imagination. The Curettes, young male divine warriors, were another crucial element of the protection. They danced around the cave where the infant lay, clashing their spears on their shields with enough noise to drown out the cries of the infant, preventing the sound from traveling to wherever Cronus might be listening, for evidence that a new child had been born. This practice of protective noise-making, which the mythology preserves in considerable detail, was connected in the ancient religious imagination to the actual cult practices of certain mystery religions. The ecstatic, noisy worship with drums and cymbals and clashing metal that was associated with the Great Mother tradition was understood in part as a ritual reenactment of this original protective noise made around the vulnerable divine child. There were also nymphs, the various divine feminine beings associated with the natural world, particularly with mountains and forests and the wild spaces of the earth, who served as nurses and caretakers for the hidden child. These nymphs were sometimes identified by name in specific traditions, Adrasteia, Ida, sometimes left more generally as the divine nursemaids of the mountain, but their function was consistent. They were the feminine protective community that Rhea was placing her child within, the extension of her own maternal care into a distributed network of divine women capable of sustaining the concealment across years. This community of protectors was, in a sense, Rhea's own love distributed into institutional form. She could not remain permanently on Crete with the infant without the concealment being discovered, could not be the sole and continuous guardian without the absence from Cronus's awareness becoming itself suspicious. She had to trust others with what was most precious to her. The network of Amalthea, the Curette, the nymphs of Crete. This was the form that trust took, the community she built around her child's safety. Chapter 11. The Presentation of the Stone. The moment of presenting the stone to Cronus was the pivotal moment in Rhea's resistance, the moment of maximum risk, the point at which the success or failure of everything depended on whether Cronus would accept the deception without examination. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes. This detail, the swaddling, the careful preparation of the disguise, suggests the thought that had gone into this moment, the deliberate craftsmanship of the deception. The stone was not simply thrust at Cronus. It was presented in the form appropriate to a newborn infant, wrapped in the way a newborn would be wrapped, presented in circumstances designed to trigger his established response without triggering anything else. She presented it to him. He swallowed it without examining what he held. This moment of successful deception was, simultaneously, a moment of profound significance in the history of the cosmos, and a moment of profound personal victory for Rhea. A small, intimate triumph that would ripple outward through time to reshape the entire structure of divine governance. She had bet everything on her understanding of her husband's psychology, on his certainty that she would not resist, on the routine quality his act of swallowing had taken on through 5 repetitions, on the fact that fear, when it becomes reflexive, stops examining its own assumptions. She had understood him. After years of watching, of enduring, of accumulating the painful knowledge of how his fear operated, she had understood him precisely enough to exploit the gap between what he expected and what she would provide. And the gap had been enough. The stone rested in Cronus's stomach, where Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon rested, an inert object amid the suspended divine lives he had been carrying. In some traditions, this stone was later disgorged along with his actual children, when Zeus finally forced the disgorgement, and became, as noted, the sacred omphalos at Delphi, the navel of the world, a mythological object so significant that it anchored one of the most important sacred sites in all of ancient Greece. A stone that had saved the future of the cosmos, swallowed in place of the one who would eventually rule that cosmos, preserved in the sacred geography of the world that cosmos contained. Rhea's deception became, in time, one of the sacred foundations of Greek religious life. Chapter 12. The Years of Concealment. The years during which Zeus grew up on Crete, concealed from his father's knowledge, were years during which Rhea had to maintain 2 performances simultaneously. The performance of the grieving mother, who had, once again, failed to produce a child that survived her husband's fear, and the private reality of the mother who had succeeded, who had successfully hidden her child, who was waiting with whatever combination of hope and terror the situation warranted for the concealment to hold through the time required for Zeus to develop. She had to live with her husband, knowing what she knew. She had to perform the grief of another child lost, while privately holding the knowledge that this one had not been lost. She had to be present with Cronus in the ordinary continuations of their shared governance of the Titan world, conducting herself in ways that would not alert him, would not trigger the search for a hidden child that would destroy everything she had arranged. This sustained deception, not the single moment of presenting the stone, but the years of ongoing management of her husband's awareness, was itself a demanding and dangerous act. She had to know him well enough not only to exploit the single moment of vulnerability, but to maintain, across years, the impression that the situation was exactly what he believed it to be. She also had to bear the specific anxiety of the mother whose child's safety depends on the success of a concealment that she cannot personally supervise with any consistency. She had left Zeus in the care of Amalthea and the Curetes and the nymphs of the mountain. Good care, careful care, sacred care. But she was not there. She could not be there. And the child, who was the repository of everything she had risked, was growing up in a cave on a distant island, with caretakers she trusted but could not control. And anything could go wrong. This specific anxiety, the anxiety of the mother who has done everything she can and then must trust others and wait, is one of the least dramatized but most humanly resonant elements of Rhea's experience, the part of her story that connects most immediately to recognizable human experience, without requiring any mythological elaboration to understand its weight. Part 4. The Development of Zeus. Chapter 13. What she knew and when. Did Rhea know about Zeus's growth and development during the years of his concealment on Crete? Did she have access to information about how the concealment was holding, about whether the child was thriving, about when he would be ready to move toward the confrontation that the prophecy had indicated was inevitable? The mythology does not answer these questions directly. The ancient sources tend to treat Rhea and Zeus as operating independently through this period. Rhea managing her husband's awareness on the mainland, or wherever the Titan governance was centered. Zeus growing up on Crete with his divine caretakers. Their next point of substantial contact in the narrative comes when Zeus is already mature and ready to act. But divine communication in the mythological world was not limited to the physical proximity that mortal communication required, and the sacred network of female divine beings who were protecting Zeus, particularly Gaia, whose counsel had set the entire plan in motion, would have been capable of providing Rhea with the updates that her maternal anxiety would have demanded if any channel for such communication existed. What is more clear is the patience the situation required of Rhea. The patience of not acting prematurely, of waiting through the necessary years of Zeus's development for him to reach the maturity that would make the eventual confrontation viable. This patience was not passive. It was the active, strategic patience of someone who understood that the timing of the challenge to Cronus would be as important as the challenge itself, that a premature attempt before Zeus was ready would not only fail, but would likely destroy whatever chances remained for success. She waited. The mythology presents this waiting as simply the passage of time, but the experience of it would have been the sustained tension of someone holding a secret whose exposure would be catastrophic, while simultaneously waiting for the moment when the secret could finally be deployed. Chapter 14. The Role of Metis. When the time came for Zeus to move toward the confrontation with his father, Metis played a crucial role, providing the emetic potion that would eventually force Cronus to disgorge the swallowed children. This counsel came through Metis's wisdom rather than through Rhea directly, though the mythology's various versions of this episode are not always entirely consistent about the sequence and attribution of the advice that shaped Zeus's strategy. Metis, whose name meant wisdom or cunning counsel, was a Titaness, the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, representing the quality of divine intelligence that operated through cleverness and strategic understanding, rather than through raw power. Her involvement in the plan to overthrow Cronus was another instance of the broader pattern in Rhea's story. The alliance of feminine intelligence and wisdom as the counterweight to masculine fear and force. The emetic that would eventually cause Cronus to vomit up his swallowed children was not a weapon of the kind that the Titanomachy would eventually feature, not a thunderbolt or a thrown mountain. It was a potion, a product of chemical knowledge, a substance that would work through Cronus's own body rather than against it from the outside. The subtlety of this approach, defeating a powerful being not through superior force, but through a carefully introduced substance that redirected his own body's processes, was characteristic of the feminine wisdom tradition that Metis represented, and that Rhea's own earlier deception had also expressed. Whether Rhea was directly involved in the planning of the emetic strategy, or whether she had handed off the active role in the plan to Zeus and Metis by this point, the mythology suggests that the approach taken was consistent with the kind of intelligence she had deployed in her own resistance to Cronus. Indirect, strategic, exploiting vulnerabilities in his own assumptions and processes rather than engaging in direct confrontation. Chapter 15. The Disgorgement. When Zeus administered the potion, in whatever disguise or circumstances allowed him to present it to his father, without alerting Cronus to his true identity or intention, the effect was what the plan had designed it to be. Cronus, affected by the emetic, vomited up the contents of his stomach. First, the stone that Rhea had presented in place of the infant Zeus, the stone that had sat in Cronus's stomach for the entire duration of Zeus's hidden childhood on Crete, the inert object that had made everything that followed possible. Then Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia, the firstborn, the one who had been inside her father longest of all, the goddess of the hearth, who had been denied the world from the very beginning of the swallowing pattern. 5 divine beings emerging from their father's body, fully grown, ready to take their place in the world that had been kept from them through the years of their confinement. They emerged not as the newborns they had been when swallowed, but as adults, their development somehow having continued even within the constrained existence of their father's body, or their divine nature having maintained them in a form appropriate to what they would become, suspended rather than arrested. The emotion of this moment, 5 children restored to Rhea, the children whose loss she had been grieving through years of sustained, dangerous waiting, is one that the mythology does not fully articulate, but that the structure of the story makes unmistakably present. This was the return of what had been taken. This was the completion of the plan she had made with her mother, and executed with the stone, and sustained through the years of concealment and waiting. This was the moment toward which all of her resistance had been building. She had her children back. Chapter 16. Before the War. The disgorgement of the 5 swallowed children set the stage for the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians that would determine the structure of the cosmos going forward. But there was a period between the disgorgement and the outbreak of full conflict, a period in which the alliances on both sides were forming, and the newly restored Olympians were beginning to understand who they were, what they were capable of, and what they were committed to. This period was, among other things, the period in which Rhea's 6 children, now including Zeus for the first time as a known present figure in the family constellation, were together as a unit for what was, in effect, the first time. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus, the 6 who'd been born to the same parents, who'd been swallowed one by one, or, in Zeus's case, saved through their mother's deception, who now found themselves together in a situation that called for alliance and mutual support. Rhea's role in this period was not primarily as a combatant. The mythology does not depict her as one of the active warriors of the Titanomachy. Her role was the role she had always been best suited for, the gathering and sustaining of the community that would make the confrontation possible. She had created this community through her pregnancies, saved it through her deception, and preserved it through her patience. Now, the community was together, and would need to hold together through what was coming. She was the mother at the center of the alliance, not the general, not the strategist, but the one whose love and suffering had made the alliance possible, the one whose experience of what Cronus had done was the emotional foundation on which the Olympians' commitment to the conflict was built. Book 3, The Cosmic Mother, Part 5, The Titanomachy and its Aftermath. Chapter 17, What Rhea Did During the War. The Titanomachy lasted, in the mythological reckoning, 10 years, a decade of cosmic violence that shook the foundations of the world and required everything the Olympians and their allies could bring to bear before it finally resolved in their favor. Rhea's position in this conflict was among the most complicated of any figure in the mythology. She was the mother of both sides. Her 6 children, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, were on the Olympian side. Her husband, Cronus, led the Titans. Her other Titan siblings were involved in various capacities, some supporting Cronus, some, like Themis and Prometheus, supporting or at least not opposing the Olympians, some, like Oceanus, maintaining a studied neutrality. The mythology does not give Rhea an active military role in the Titanomachy. She is not a warrior in the tradition's account of this conflict, but neither does she appear as a passive bystander, and the tradition's complex memory of her position during this period, neither simply aligned with her children against her husband, nor aligned with her husband against her children, reflects something true about the impossible position she occupied. She had made her choice clearly when she saved Zeus. She had committed herself, through that act and through the years of concealment that followed, to the cause of her children over the cause of her husband, to the Olympian future over the Titan present. The Titanomachy was, in an important sense, the consequence of the choice she had already made years earlier, the public and cosmic expression of the private decision to resist that had begun with a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. But the public expression of that choice, the 10-year war in which her children fought against her husband and her siblings, was not something she experienced without cost. even if the mythology does not attend to this cost. With the same detail, it applies to other aspects of her story. She had not wished for this war. She had wished for her children to exist and develop freely in the world. The war was the mechanism through which that became possible. But mechanism and wish are not the same thing, and the experience of watching one's children engaged in cosmic conflict against one's husband and siblings is not easily reduced to simple partisanship. Chapter 18. After the defeat of the Titans. When the Titanomachy ended in the Olympians' victory, when Cronus and the Titans who had supported him were bound and cast down into Tartarus, and the Olympians stood in possession of the cosmos they would now govern, Rhea's position shifted in ways that the mythology registers, but does not always fully examine. She was no longer the queen of the Titan Age. She was no longer the partner in governance of the divine being who had ruled the cosmos. She was no longer the woman who was performing elaborate concealment and deception in order to protect her children from her husband's destructive fear. She was the mother of the new rulers, the grandmother, in some sense, of the divine age that was now beginning, not genealogically, but in terms of her position relative to the new structure of power. The divine generation she had produced was now the governing generation, and her position in relation to that generation was that of the parent who had not only produced, but protected, who had not only given birth, but given the children back to themselves when they had been taken. This was a position of enormous honor and enormous complexity. The 6 Olympians who now governed the cosmos owed their existence and their freedom to their mother's choices, her suffering, and her resistance. This was not a debt easily discharged, or a claim easily asserted, and the mythology's subsequent accounts of Rhea's role in the Olympian age suggest a figure who was honored, but perhaps not always easily accommodated, respected, but not always well understood by the generation whose freedom she had made possible. Chapter 19. The New Order and the Old Mother. The Olympian order that Zeus and his siblings established was, in important respects, a different kind of divine governance from the Titan age it replaced. The Titans had been primarily the cosmic principles given divine form, vast, elemental, not organized into the kind of differentiated bureaucracy of specific domains that characterized the Olympian settlement. The Olympians were more specific, more personal, more involved in the particular affairs of the mortal world, and in each other's particular relationships and conflicts. Rhea, as a Titaness, as the great mother who predated this new mode of divine governance, did not always fit neatly into the organizational structure of Olympus. She was honored, deeply honored, given the title Mother of the Gods. But she was not a bureaucratic figure with a specific domain in the Olympian sense. She was something older and larger than the Olympian organization could fully contain, a figure whose significance transcended the specific competencies and conflicts that characterized the Olympian pantheon. This positioning, honored, ancient, somewhat larger than the structure she was supposed to fit within, gave her a specific role in the subsequent mythology. She was the one who remembered what had come before, the one whose experience and authority exceeded that of even the most powerful of the Olympians, the one who could sometimes intervene in conflicts that the Olympians themselves were too enmeshed in to resolve. The mythology records a small number of such interventions, moments in which Rhea's authority was invoked to settle or advise, in situations that had exceeded the capacity of the Olympian hierarchy, to manage through its own resources. These moments were not primary mythological narratives. They were episodes, interventions, moments when the ancient figure was called upon because something that the new divine order could not fully contain required the wisdom of the old. Chapter 20. The Reconciliation Tradition. Some traditions preserved a specific episode that represented a reconciliation between Rhea and Cronus after the Titanomachy. An episode that, if it occurred in the mythological logic, would represent one of the most dramatically and psychologically complex events in the entire tradition. The tradition suggesting that Cronus was not permanently confined in Tartarus, but eventually restored to a kind of rule in the Isles of the Blessed, or in the Roman tradition, to an honored position as the god of an earlier, more just age, implies that the conflict between the Titan generation and the Olympian generation was not permanently absolute. Some form of settlement, some form of reconciliation, or at least accommodation, was possible. What Rhea's experience of such a reconciliation, if it occurred, would have been like is a question the mythology does not answer. She had suffered through 5 swallowings and years of dangerous concealment and a cosmic war in which her children fought against her husband. She had made her choice clearly and had never, in the mythological record, expressed anything that suggested regret for that choice. And yet Cronus was the father of her children, had been her partner in the governance of the Titan Age, had been, during the period of the Golden Age that the tradition remembered with such fondness, something other than the terrible figure that fear eventually made him. The mythology's silence about Rhea's experience of whatever reconciliation or settlement occurred is, in this case, a silence that speaks. The tradition was not equipped, in the ancient sources, to fully explore what it would mean for a woman to navigate the aftermath of this kind of history. The years of repeated loss, the deception that saved the 6th child, the war that ended the marriage's political context, and then whatever form of continued existence, with or in relation to, the person who had caused all of this followed. This silence does not mean the experience was simple, or that the mythology had no understanding of its complexity. It means the tradition chose, for various reasons of focus and priority, to leave this particular dimension of Rhea's experience unexamined in the preserved sources. Book 4, The Great Mother, Part 6, The Religious Tradition. Chapter 21, The Cult of the Great Mother. Whatever the specific details of Rhea's individual mythological narrative, her significance in the ancient world was not primarily narrative. She was, above all, a figure of religious devotion, the object of one of the most widely distributed and most ancient cults in the Mediterranean world. A cult that expressed something so fundamental about human religious experience that it appeared, in various forms, across a remarkable range of cultures and historical periods. The cult of the Great Mother, known by various names in different cultural contexts, but recognizable across these contexts by its consistent symbolic vocabulary of mountains, wild animals, particularly lions, drums and ecstatic music, and the feminine as the supreme generative principle, was ancient before the specifically Greek tradition of Rhea as a Titan queen existed. It was practiced in Anatolia and Crete and throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in forms that predated the Greek mythological system by millennia. What the Greeks did when they encountered these traditions and developed their own mythological account of Rhea was integrate this ancient and widespread religious phenomenon into their emerging cosmological narrative, giving the Great Mother a specific genealogical position, daughter of Uranus and Gaia, wife of Cronus, mother of the Olympians, a specific mythological history, the swallowings, the resistance, the protection of Zeus, and a specific name, Rhea, a name whose etymology is uncertain, but which some ancient sources connected to flow or ease in ways that resonated with the goddess's generative and flowing nature. But the integration was never complete, because the ancient and widespread reality that Rhea represented was too large and too old to be fully contained within any single cultural tradition's mythological narrative. The drums and the ecstatic worship and the lion imagery and the mountain shrines persisted alongside and sometimes in tension with the more respectable Olympian religion, expressing through these ancient practices a religious impulse that the rationalized mythology of the Olympians could not fully satisfy. Chapter 22. The Phrygia Connection and Cybele. The identification of Rhea with Cybele, the Phrygian Great Mother, was one of the most significant religious developments in the ancient Mediterranean world, and it deserves extended consideration because it illuminates aspects of Rhea's divine character that the specifically Greek mythological narrative does not fully develop. Cybele was worshipped at Pessinus in Phrygia, in modern-day Turkey, as the supreme goddess, the mother of the gods, the lady of the animals, the goddess whose sacred symbol was a black meteoric stone, itself an echo of Rhea's mythologically significant stone, and whose worship involved the ecstatic practices of the Galli, the castrated priests who devoted themselves entirely to her service. The Galli were themselves a mythological reference. They were understood in the tradition that connected Cybele to Rhea as connected to the story of Attis, the beautiful youth whom Cybele loved and who was driven mad or castrated. Accounts varied after violating his vow to her. The Galli's self-castration reenacted this founding myth, their mutilation expressing in bodily form the absolute devotion to the goddess that the myth required. This tradition, the Great Mother, the castrated priests, the ecstatic worship, had connections to Rhea's mythology at multiple levels. The castration of Uranus that Cronus had performed at Gaia's instigation was another sacred castration story, another foundational mythological event in which the masculine reproductive principle was violently interrupted to create the conditions for a new order. The wild, ecstatic worship of the mother was recognizable in both traditions when the Romans adopted the worship of Cybele, importing the sacred black stone from Pessinus to Rome in 204 BCE, at the height of the Second Punic War, in response to a Sibylline oracle that promised victory if the Magna Mater was installed in Rome. They were, in their own interpretation, bringing to Rome the goddess they understood as Rhea, Saturn's queen, the mother of the gods whose children included the Roman gods' Olympian equivalents. The Roman Magna Mater cult became one of the most important religious institutions in the Roman world, practiced with considerable fervor and some official ambivalence for centuries, until the Christianization of the empire eventually displaced, though never entirely eliminated, the ancient impulse it expressed. Chapter 23. The Cretan Tradition. The Cretan tradition of Rhea was in some ways the most ancient and the most directly preserved of all the regional cults associated with her. Crete, as the island where Zeus was born and raised in the mythology, was understood as a place of particularly intense connection to the mother of the gods, a place where her worship was most deeply rooted and most authentically expressed. The cave on Mount Ida and the cave on Mount Dicte, the two primary locations associated with Zeus's birth and hidden childhood, were sacred sites in their own right, places of pilgrimage and religious observance that attracted worshippers for centuries because of their connection to the most important birth in the mythological tradition. To visit these caves was to visit the place where Rhea had brought her child into the world in safety, where the divine infant had been nursed by Amalthea and protected by the Curetes, where the future of the cosmos had been quietly and carefully prepared in the darkness of the mountain. But the Cretan religious tradition was also, in its pre-Greek Minoan layer, a tradition of goddess worship that was considerably older than the specifically Greek mythological narrative of Rhea. The Minoan civilization that had flourished on Crete for millennia before the Greek-speaking world emerged had its own goddess traditions involving the snake goddess, the bull-leaping rituals, the sacred feminine as the dominant divine principle that informed the later Greek understanding of what Rhea and her Cretan connections meant. When the Greek tradition insisted that Zeus had been born on Crete and that Rhea had brought him there for his concealment, it was, among other things, acknowledging the antiquity and sacred authority of the Cretan religious tradition, recognizing that Crete was the kind of place where the most fundamental divine events could happen, where the earth's own sacred power was most concentrated and most protective, where a divine child could grow up in safety precisely because the holiness of the place was older and deeper than any pursuing fear could penetrate. Chapter 24. The Mountain Mother. Across the various traditions associated with Rhea, one symbolic element was nearly universal: the mountain. She was a mountain goddess. Her worship was conducted on mountains and in mountain caves. She was depicted on a mountain throne, attended by lions, surrounded by the wild mountain landscape that was her natural environment. The mountains were her home in a way that the organized, domesticated spaces of Olympian cult were not. She belonged to the high, wild, ancient places where the earth's own power was most directly felt. The mountain symbolism was not incidental. Mountains were, in the ancient Greek and more broadly ancient Mediterranean religious imagination, the places where the boundary between the human world and the divine was thinnest, where the earth reached up most directly toward the sky, where the ordinary separation of the mortal from the divine was most attenuated. Mountains were sacred in almost every ancient religion. Mount Olympus as the home of the Olympian gods, Mount Sinai as the place of divine revelation in the Near Eastern tradition, countless sacred peaks across cultures that understood the mountain as the meeting point of the above and the below. But Rhea's mountains were not the refined and ordered Olympus of Zeus's court. They were the wild mountains, the untamed heights, the rugged terrain, the places where civilization had not yet imposed its order on the natural landscape. Her mountains were the mountains of the Cretan highlands, the Phrygian peaks where Cybele was worshipped, the wild places where the earth's own power was most rawly present. This wildness was essential to her nature. She was not the divine feminine domesticated by civilization, organized into appropriate roles within a structured divine hierarchy. She was the divine feminine in its most ancient and least domesticated form, powerful, generative, associated with the wild animals that expressed that power, the lions that flanked her throne, the bears and bees and the other creatures of the mountain world, worshipped with ecstatic physical practices that stood in contrast to the more measured forms of civic religion. Chapter 25. The Lions. Lions appeared with Rhea consistently and significantly across the various traditions that depicted her. They flanked her throne in iconography. They drew her chariot in some accounts. They were the symbol most consistently associated with her divine authority. The animals that expressed in their form and behavior something essential about what she was. Why lions? The lion was, in the ancient Mediterranean world, the supreme predator, the animal of maximum power, the beast that killed without being prey to anything else in the natural hierarchy of the animal world. The lion's authority in the animal kingdom was understood as analogous to divine authority in the cosmic hierarchy, supreme, unchallengeable, expressing power not through aggression, but through the simple fact of what it was. For the Great Mother to be flanked by lions was to express her divine authority through the most powerful symbol available in the natural world. Not the authority of the organized state, not the authority of the divine bureaucracy, but the authority of the ancient, the wild, the power that preceded and exceeded the organized structures that civilization imposed. But there was another resonance as well. The lion was associated with protective ferocity, with the mother lion, who was among the most dangerous of all animals when defending her cubs. The female, whose nurturing and protective capacities were expressed not through gentleness alone, but through the capacity for terrible violence when what she protected was threatened. Rhea with her lions expressed both dimensions of the Great Mother's authority. The ancient, supreme, pre-civilizational power of the divine feminine, and the specific fierce protectiveness of the mother who would do anything necessary to protect what she had produced. She was the queen of the wild, and she was the mother who had wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes to deceive a terrifying husband. And both were the same divine figure, expressed in different registers, appropriate to different moments of her story. Part 7. Rhea in the later mythology. Chapter 26. The Mother-in-Law. After the Titanomachy and the establishment of the Olympian order, Rhea's role in the subsequent mythology was primarily the role of the elder divine woman, the grandmother, in effect, of the divine world's next generation, the figure who watched from her position of great honor and occasional invisibility as her children and their children populated the mythological narratives with their conflicts and loves and adventures. She was, most directly, the mother-in-law of most of the Olympians' consorts. Hera was both her daughter and her daughter-in-law, the wife of her son Zeus, a structural complexity that the mythology acknowledged, but did not always fully explore. Persephone was her granddaughter, daughter of Demeter, who was Rhea's daughter, making the abduction of Persephone by Hades a family crisis in which Rhea's position was particularly complex. Her son had taken her granddaughter. Her other daughter was suffering the grief of a lost child, and the world was suffering the consequences in the form of Demeter's grief-induced refusal to let things grow. The mythology records Rhea's involvement in the resolution of the Demeter-Persephone situation, at least in some versions. She was among the figures who eventually brought the two, Demeter and the gods who negotiated for Persephone's return. Together, her authority as the mother of both Demeter and Hades, lending her a unique position to intervene in a family crisis that had become a cosmic one. This pattern, the ancient mother whose position in the family of the gods gave her a unique standing to intervene in conflicts that directly involved her children, was characteristic of her role in the later mythology. She was not a primary figure in these later episodes. They were her children's stories, not hers. But she appeared at the margins, her authority acknowledged, her influence occasionally decisive, in ways the narrative did not always fully foreground. Chapter 27. Rhea and Demeter. The relationship between Rhea and Demeter was, in the mythology's logic, one of the most significant mother-daughter relationships in the divine world. Significant both because of its genealogical position, Rhea as the mother of all the Olympians, Demeter as the Olympian whose own story most directly echoed certain elements of Rhea's, and because of the deep structural parallels between their two divine natures. Both were goddess associated with fertility, with the earth's generative abundance, with the transformation of the natural into the nurturing. Demeter was the goddess of grain specifically, of cultivated agriculture, of the specific human transformation of the earth's wild productivity into the managed productivity of the farm. Rhea was the goddess of the earth's generative abundance more generally, of the wild and the cultivated both, of the mountain and the field, of the principle of generation that preceded its specifically agricultural expression. They were, in a sense, the same divine reality at different scales and in different modes. Rhea as the cosmic expression of the generative earth, Demeter as the same principle expressed in the specific mode of grain cultivation and the agricultural life that depended on it. This similarity made their relationship in the mythology particularly resonant. When Demeter lost Persephone and withdrew her divine function, when the grief of the lost daughter caused the earth to become barren, she was, in a sense, enacting something structurally similar to what Rhea had endured through the years of the swallowings. The loss of the child, the withdrawal of the mother's nurturing function in response to that loss, the world suffering the consequences of the divine mother's grief. Rhea, who had experienced the loss of 5 children before finding the way to resist and the way to recover them, was perhaps uniquely positioned to understand what Demeter was experiencing. And her intervention in the resolution of the Persephone situation bringing Demeter back from her grief-induced withdrawal, persuading her that a partial return was better than the total loss that the earth's continued barrenness would eventually produce, carried the authority of someone who had been through the loss of children and had found, eventually, a way to get them back. Chapter 28. The Relationship with Zeus. The relationship between Rhea and Zeus, mother and son, the one who saved him and the one who was saved, the ancient Titan queen and the new Olympian king, was among the most significant and the least fully examined of all the divine relationships the mythology preserved. She had saved his life. This was not an abstraction. She had gone to Crete to give birth, had accepted the pain and risk of that journey. She had deceived her own husband at enormous personal risk. She had sustained the concealment through years that required managing Cronus's expectations while holding the knowledge of the deception. She had trusted Zeus's life to others and endured the anxiety of not being able to protect him directly. She had done all of this, and the result was the divine being who now governed the cosmos. Zeus knew this. The mythology does not give us extended scenes of his relationship with his mother in the aftermath of his victory, but the honor accorded to Rhea in the subsequent tradition, the title Mother of the Gods, the Olympian acknowledgement of her precedence, the moments of deference recorded in various episodes, suggests a relationship in which Zeus's awareness of what he owed his mother was genuine and expressed in concrete acts of honor and consultation. He also needed her. This is less obvious but no less true. Zeus, in establishing the new Olympian order, needed the legitimacy that only the connection to what came before could provide. He was not the original divine power. He was the winner of a generational conflict, the one who had overthrown the previous order and established a new one. His claim to authority was the claim of the victorious, which was strong, but not the same as the claim of the ancient and primordial. Rhea was that ancient and primordial. Her authority preceded his, was older than his, was rooted in the primordial generation, rather than in victory over the primordial generation. Having her acknowledgement and her presence within his cosmic order was part of how Zeus legitimized the new arrangement, not merely as the son of the previous king, but as the son of the one whose age and authority exceeded even the Titan generation. Chapter 29. The protective function continues. Rhea's protective function did not end with the protection of the infant Zeus. It continued in various forms through the subsequent mythology. The ancient mother whose love for her children expressed itself in interventions that exceeded what the Olympian structure would otherwise allow. The mythology preserves several episodes in which Rhea's protection or intercession extended to figures who needed shelter or assistance that the organized Olympian hierarchy could not or would not provide. These episodes are not always prominent in the mythological record, but they are consistent in their logic. Rhea as the refuge, the protector, the one whose authority and whose love were available to those in extremis. This continuation of the protective function was connected, in the religious imagination, to her identity as the Great Mother. The Great Mother was not only the cosmic principle of generation, she was also the goddess who received those in need of sanctuary, who provided the sheltering embrace of the divine maternal to those the organized structures of the world had excluded or threatened. Her mountains were places of refuge. Her caves were sanctuaries. Her worship communities were, in the ancient world's actual religious practice, spaces where the ordinary hierarchies and exclusions of the organized world were suspended in favor of the equalizing presence of the Divine Mother. This function expressed something essential about the Great Mother tradition that was not always captured in the specifically mythological narratives. She was the refuge, not only the origin, not only the generator, but the place of return. The Divine Mother to whom one could return when the organized world had become too threatening or too constraining. The ancient presence whose welcome was available, regardless of what the organized divine hierarchy might think about the one seeking it. Book 5. The Theological Depth. Part 8. What she represented. Chapter 30. The primacy of the maternal. Rhea's mythology was, at its deepest level, a meditation on the primacy of the maternal, on the claim that the generative and nurturing function of the mother was not secondary to other forms of divine power, but was, in its own way, the most fundamental form of divine power there was. The mythology that organized the Greek divine world primarily around the authority of Zeus and the other male Olympians was itself a secondary mythology, a mythology that had developed over and around an older, more pervasive religious tradition in which the feminine divine was not secondary but primary, was not the consort or the mother of the male gods, but was the original and supreme divine reality. Rhea stood at the boundary between these two traditions, embodying both. She was, in the mythological narrative, the wife of Cronus and the mother of Zeus, defined partly through her relationships to male divine figures. But she was also the Great Mother, the ancient goddess of the mountains and the wild, the figure whose cult expressed a form of religious devotion that was older and more widespread than the specifically Olympian theology. This dual positioning gave her a particular significance in the ancient religious imagination. She was the moment at which the older tradition and the newer tradition met, the figure through whom the Great Mother of the ancient world became the mother of the gods in the organized mythology of the Olympian age. The fact that she occupied this boundary position between ancient and newer, between the cosmic feminine and the specific narrative role, made her symbolically and religiously more complex than either of the traditions she straddled. She was the carrier of the older tradition within the newer structure, the living embodiment of the ancient feminine divine in the mythology of the male organized Olympian cosmos. Chapter 31. The creative resistance. One of the most important and least examined aspects of Rhea's mythology was the specific quality of her resistance to her husband's cruelty. The kind of resistance she enacted, as distinct from the simple fact that she resisted. She did not resist through violence. She was not, in the tradition's depiction of her, a warrior goddess who challenged Cronus in battle or confronted him with force. She was a goddess whose power expressed itself through intelligence, through cunning, through the patient exploitation of vulnerability in a situation where direct confrontation would have been both futile and dangerous. The stone wrapped in swaddling clothes was not a weapon. It was an act of creative deception, a manipulation of expectation, a redirection of fear's established response. a use of the established pattern's own predictability against itself. Rhea defeated the most powerful being in the cosmos, not by being stronger than him, but by being smarter than him, more patient than him, more willing to use the tools available to her, rather than demanding tools that were not. This kind of resistance, indirect, intelligent, creative, exploiting the vulnerability in the oppressor's own method, has been, historically, the form of resistance most available to those who lacked the power for direct confrontation. And the mythology's honoring of this form of resistance as the decisive act in the divine succession, as the thing that made the Titanomachy possible, that gave the Olympians their champion, that changed the structure of the cosmos, was itself a theological statement about the value of this kind of intelligence. The Great Mother, in the mythology's account, defeated the Titan King not through the kind of power that would be recognized as masculine divine power, the thunderbolt, the cosmic force, the direct confrontation of divine wills, but through the kind of intelligence that centuries of patriarchal tradition would later undervalue as mere cleverness or deception. The mythology did not undervalue it. The mythology made it the decisive act. Chapter 32. Endurance and its meaning. The endurance that Rhea demonstrated through the years of the swallowings, the sustained bearing of repeated loss, the patient maintenance of long-term strategic thinking amid immediate devastating grief, the refusal to either accept the situation as permanent or to act prematurely in ways that would destroy the eventual possibility of correction, was itself a form of divine power that the mythology honored without always articulating. This endurance was not passive. This point cannot be made too strongly, because the mythology's relative silence about Rhea's interior experience during those years can create the impression that she was simply suffering, simply waiting, simply the patient victim of her husband's cruelty without the active agency that would make her a figure of admiration rather than merely of sympathy. But the endurance of the unbearable in service of the eventual possible is itself an active achievement, a form of strength that is not less impressive for being less visible than the more dramatic forms of divine power that the mythology's narrative tends to foreground. Rhea's endurance through 5 swallowings, maintaining strategic clarity while experiencing profound personal grief, keeping the long view while living through a devastating present. This was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. Without that endurance, no stone in swaddling clothes. Without the stone, no hidden Zeus. Without the hidden Zeus, no Titanomachy, no Olympian order, no subsequent mythology as we know it. She endured so that eventually something different would be possible. The endurance was not the same as acceptance, not the same as resignation, not the same as the abandonment of hope that the situation, objectively considered, might have seemed to justify. It was the specific strength of the person who can say, not yet, but eventually, and who can sustain both the not yet and the eventually across the span of time that eventually requires. Chapter 33. The Gift of the Stone. The stone that Rhea presented to Cronus in place of the infant Zeus became one of the most mythologically significant objects in all of Greek religion, the omphalos at Delphi, the navel of the world, the sacred stone that marked the center of the cosmos in the Greek sacred geography. This transformation of the deception's instrument into the center of the world was, in the mythology's logic, entirely appropriate. The act that saved Zeus, that preserved the future king of the gods from his father's destroying fear, that made the Olympian age possible. This act was the act most deserving of the designation, the center of everything. The stone that stood in for the savior of the cosmos was appropriately the stone that marked the center of the cosmos in the sacred geography that the savior's eventual victory established. But the omphalos was also more profoundly a monument to Rhea herself, to her intelligence, her courage, her love for her child, her willingness to risk everything in a single act of carefully considered deception. Every pilgrim who came to Delphi to consult the oracle, every person who touched or passed the sacred stone at the center of the world, was, whether they knew it or not, in the presence of the monument to a mother's refusal to let fear destroy what she had created. The most sacred site of divine communication in the Greek world, the place where the divine spoke to the human most directly, where the oracle's answers shaped the choices of kings and cities and individuals across centuries, was centered on the stone that Rhea had wrapped in swaddling clothes. The center of the world was the object of her resistance. This is, when examined, one of the most profound religious statements in the entire mythological tradition. The mother's love, expressed in an act of creative deception against a destroying fear, was the center of the world. Not a battle, not a divine proclamation. A stone wrapped in cloth. The most intimate and human of all the mythology's divine acts became, in the sacred geography that followed, the literal center around which everything else was organized. Part 9. The Continuing Presence. Chapter 34. The Goddess in Time. The worship of Rhea and of the great mother tradition she represented persisted through an extraordinary span of historical time. From the Minoan civilization's apparent goddess traditions in the 3rd millennium BCE, through the Phrygian Cybele worship, through the Roman adoption of the Magna Mater cult in the 3rd century BCE, through the various mystery religions and later religious movements that drew on the archetype of the Divine Mother, and eventually into the theological imagination of the Christian tradition, which developed its own forms of the divine maternal in the figure of Mary, the Mother of God. This persistence was not mere historical coincidence. The archetype that Rhea represented, the divine feminine as the generative, nurturing, protecting mother, the great mother who is simultaneously the source of life, the sustainer of the living, and the refuge of those in need, was not a culturally specific theological development that happened to spread across the ancient world. It was a response to something fundamental in human experience, something about the way human beings understood their own origins and their own need for protection and sustenance. Infants require mothers. Children require nurturing. The experience of being generated and sustained by a larger, more powerful being. The experience that every living person has had in their most fundamental relationship, the relationship with the mother, becomes, in the religious imagination, the template for the relationship between the human and the divine. The divine is experienced as the cosmic mother, the one who generated all that exists and who sustains it through love and through the inexhaustible abundance that love generates. Rhea was one of the most fully developed expressions of this fundamental religious intuition that the ancient world produced. Her mythology, her cult practices, her symbolic vocabulary of mountains and lions and drums, all of these were the specific cultural expression of a religious impulse that was as old as human beings had experienced the need for the divine, and that would continue to express itself in new cultural forms for as long as that need persisted. Chapter 35. The Modern Resonance. The world that inherited Rhea's mythology, through the literary tradition, through the artistic tradition, through the Jungian psychological tradition that took the archetype of the Great Mother as one of its central organizing concepts, has found in her story resonances that extend far beyond the specific details of the ancient mythological narrative. The image of the mother who endures repeated loss without losing the capacity for love, who maintains strategic clarity while experiencing devastating grief, who uses intelligence and patience rather than force to protect what she loves. This image speaks to dimensions of human experience that are not limited to the context of divine succession among the Titans. The psychology of the protective mother, operating in situations of genuine threat, finding the space for creative resistance when direct confrontation would be futile or dangerous. This psychology is not confined to mythology. It appears in the histories of women and communities throughout human history who have faced situations analogous in human scale to Rhea's, the powerful figure whose fear drove them to destroy what they should have protected, the mother who found, in the specific vulnerability of the powerful's own established patterns, the opening for the deception that saved what could be saved. The mythology's choice of this specific form of resistance, indirect, intelligent, patient, exploiting the oppressor's own established patterns, as the decisive act in the most important succession story, the tradition preserved was not arbitrary. It was the tradition's recognition that this kind of intelligence was itself heroic, that the mother who had found the way to save the future when more direct forms of power were unavailable was as worthy of the tradition's highest honors as any warrior or divine champion. Chapter 36. The Question of Justice. Looking back at the full arc of Rhea's story, a question emerges that the mythology raises without fully answering. Did Rhea receive justice? She endured 5 swallowings of her children. She sustained years of dangerous concealment while performing the appearance of acquiescence to a husband who had destroyed what she had created. She organized and executed the deception that saved Zeus. She sustained the concealment through the years required for Zeus to develop. She watched a cosmic war unfold that was, in part, the consequence of her own choices. And then her children governed the cosmos. The generation she had saved governed the world that her patience and courage had made it possible for them to govern. She was honored, given the title Mother of the Gods, accorded a position of great respect in the Olympian divine hierarchy, remembered across centuries and cultures as the Great Mother, one of the most widely worshipped divine figures in the ancient world. Was this justice? Did the honor she received in the subsequent tradition adequately acknowledge what she had experienced and what she had done. The mythology does not ask this question directly, and the tradition's answer, insofar as it has one, is implicitly yes. That the honor and the position she received in the Olympian order constituted appropriate recognition of her suffering and her achievement. But the question itself, once asked, is not so easily set aside. The title, Mother of the Gods, was real and meaningful. The religious devotion of millions across centuries was real. The centrality of her monument, the omphalos, at the most sacred site of Greek religious life, was real. But she had also lost 5 children to her husband's fear for years before finding the way to resist. She had endured what she endured, and whatever honor came after, the endurance was hers. And no subsequent honor fully healed what the endurance had required of her. The mythology's silence on this question, the lack of any equivalent to the modern concern with trauma, healing, and the adequacy of recompense for suffering, does not resolve it. It leaves it as the question it is, a question about whether what came after could be adequate to what came before, a question about justice and suffering that the ancient tradition raised through the structure of Rhea's story, without providing the clean resolution that the question's difficulty might seem to demand. Book 6, The Fullness of the Story. Part 10, Integration. Chapter 37, The Complete Figure. She was many things simultaneously, and the attempt to reduce her to any single one of them distorts what the full tradition preserved. She was Rhea the Titaness, the daughter of sky and earth, the sister and wife of Cronus, the queen of the Titan age, the figure who stood at the hinge between 2 divine generations, and who was defined by this position in ways she did not choose and could not escape. She was the suffering mother, the woman who bore 5 children and watched each one swallowed by her husband's fear, who endured this repeated loss with the patience and clarity required to eventually find the way to resist, who paid an enormous personal price for the eventual victory that her resistance made possible. She was the courageous deceiver, the one who wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to the most powerful being in the cosmos with sufficient composure that he swallowed it without examining what he held, who managed the concealment of this deception across years, who sustained the riskiest secret of the mythological age with the discipline and intelligence it required. She was the Great Mother, the ancient goddess of the mountains and the wild, the divine feminine in its most primordial and most universal form, the figure through whom the ancient Great Mother tradition of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world was given a specific place in the Greek mythological narrative, while remaining too large and too old to be fully contained by that narrative. She was the honored elder, the grandmother of the divine world in the age that followed her children's victory, the figure whose authority and whose suffering gave her a unique standing in the Olympian order, whose occasional interventions in her children's and grandchildren's stories carried the weight of the ancient and the experienced. She was all of these simultaneously. The full tradition preserved all of these. And to tell her story fully requires holding all of these, without allowing any one of them to consume the others, without the dramatic narrative of the swallowings and the resistance overshadowing the cosmic significance of the Great Mother. Without the cosmic significance of the Great Mother abstracting away from the specific human-scale experience of the mother who endured repeated loss and found the way to resist. Chapter 38. What she knew. Rhea knew things that the mythology does not always credit her with knowing. She knew Cronus, knew him with the specific, accumulated, detail-rich knowledge of the person who has lived alongside another person, through both the good and the devastating, who has seen both the golden age and the fear, who understands the specific mechanisms of the other's psychology, because she has had years to observe them in the context of her own suffering. She knew what it meant to lose a child, not in the abstract, not as a theological proposition about the nature of divine generation and divine succession, but in the experienced, embodied, specific reality of 5 consecutive pregnancies that ended in swallowing. She knew grief. She knew the specific grief of the loss that was not death, the grief of the child suspended, present but absent, existing but not living. She knew this grief 5 times. She knew patience, not as a passive virtue, not as the simple endurance of someone who had no other options, but as an active strategic stance, the patient waiting of someone who had identified the eventual possible and was holding toward it across the span of time required, without allowing the immediate to collapse the eventual into mere wishful thinking. She knew what love required, not what love felt like. That is easier. That is the language of feeling and attachment, and the warmth of connection. She knew what love required, what it demanded in terms of action, in terms of risk, in terms of the willingness to endure what could not yet be resisted, and to act when acting became possible. Love, in her experience, was not primarily a feeling. It was a practice. The sustained practice of doing what the beloved's well-being required, across whatever span of time and difficulty that requiring extended. She knew the stone she had chosen, knew what she was doing when she presented it, knew the vulnerability in her husband's established response that the stone would exploit, knew the risk, and had calculated it sufficiently to conclude that the risk was worth taking. This knowledge was not intuition. It was the fruit of years of watching, grieving, and thinking. Chapter 39. What she taught. The tradition that preserved Rhea's mythology was teaching something through her story, not in the didactic, explicit way of the fable or the moral lesson, but in the deeper way that mythology teaches, through the structure and the imagery and the pattern of events, rather than through explicit statement. It was teaching that the most fundamental divine power was not the power of the thunderbolt, or the trident, or the cosmic authority that the Olympian mythology more usually foregrounded. The most fundamental divine power was the power of generation and protection, the power of the mother who produces and who defends what she produces. Rhea, who held neither thunderbolt nor trident, whose authority was not expressed through the kinds of force that the Olympian mythology's drama most often featured, was nonetheless the decisive figure in the most important succession in the entire mythological tradition. It was teaching that intelligence and patience, and the willingness to use what was available, including the most humble and mundane of objects, a stone, were not second-best substitutes for more impressive forms of power. They were forms of power in their own right, forms that could accomplish what more obvious and more celebrated forms of power could not. The stone that saved Zeus was not an impressive object. The intelligence that deployed it was extraordinary. It was teaching that endurance could itself be heroic, that the sustained bearing of the unbearable in service of the eventually possible was as deserving of honor as the dramatic act of resistance that finally became possible after the endurance. The mythology honored Rhea not only for the deception with the stone, but for the years of endurance that had made that deception possible. And it was teaching, through the figure of the Great Mother, with her mountains and her lions and her drums and her ecstatic worship, that the divine feminine was not less than the divine masculine, but different from it, older in some respects, and more fundamental, the generative principle that preceded the organized hierarchy, and that would persist beyond any specific arrangement of that hierarchy. Chapter 40. The Mother of What Followed. Everything that came after in the Greek mythological tradition, Zeus and his adventures and his governance of the cosmos, Hera and her formidable authority and her wounded pride, Demeter and the cycle of the seasons, Poseidon and the sea's power, Hades and the kingdom of the dead, Hestia and the sacred fire of every home. All of it came through Rhea. This is not merely the genealogical fact of her maternity, though the genealogy is real and significant. It is the deeper fact that the Olympian age itself, the divine arrangement that the Greek tradition's most enduring mythology depicted, was possible only because of Rhea's choices, Rhea's suffering, Rhea's intelligence, and Rhea's love. The mythology we know as Greek mythology is, in this sense, Rhea's product. Not hers alone. Gaia was there, and the pattern of divine succession was larger than any single figure's choices, but hers in the sense that matters most. Without the stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, without the hidden childhood on Crete, without the years of maintained concealment, there is no Zeus. Without Zeus, there is no Titanomachy. Without the Titanomachy, there is no Olympian order. Without the Olympian order, there is no subsequent mythology, as the tradition preserved it. The mother of the gods was the mother of the stories about the gods. Her love and her resistance were the precondition of the entire tradition. This is not a minor contribution. It is not the supporting role that the tradition's narrative focus on Zeus and the Olympians can make it appear. It is the founding condition, the enabling act, the necessary prior, without which none of what followed would have been possible. She was the mother of what followed. Everything that followed was, in this sense, her child. Epilogue: the stone and the child. She held two things in her hands. In one hand, a stone, grey and cold and ordinary, the substance of the earth she was, and the instrument of the deception she had planned. The stone that would fool a god, the stone that would change the world. In the other hand, the memory of 5 children she had not been able to save, and the knowledge of the one she was about to. She was the daughter of sky and earth, queen of the Titan Age, wife of the ruler of the cosmos, the most powerful queen in the history of the divine world. And she was holding a stone in a blanket, performing the most vulnerable and the most decisive act of her existence. She went to her husband. She held out the stone. He swallowed it. She had saved the future. This moment, a mother with a stone, deceiving a destroying fear, saving what she loved, was the center around which the Greek mythological tradition organized its most sacred geography. The omphalos at Delphi, the navel of the world, the place where the divine communicated most directly with the human, was the stone she had held. The center of the cosmos was the instrument of a mother's love. She did not know in that moment that the stone she was holding would become sacred. She did not know that the child she was saving would go on to govern the cosmos, that the war she was preparing for would shake the foundations of the world, that her own name would be honored across millennia and across cultures as the Mother of Gods. She knew she loved her child. She knew what she was risking. She knew what she hoped. That was enough. It was, as the subsequent history of the divine world demonstrated, more than enough. It was everything. Rhea, daughter of the sky and the earth, queen of the Titan Age, mother of the Olympians, great mother of the mountains and the wild, the one who held the stone, and the one who saved the future. She is the mother in the middle of everything. She is where the story turns. She is the woman with the stone. Here ends the story of Rhea, daughter of Uranus and Gaia, wife of Cronus, mother of Hestia and Demeter, and Hera and Hades and Poseidon and Zeus, the great mother of the mountains and the wild, the goddess honored across millennia as the mother of the gods. She endured 5 swallowings. She wrapped a stone in cloth. She saved the future. She outlasted the age she was born into. She was honored in the age that came after. She is the mother in the center of everything that followed. The stone is at Delphi. The center of the world is where she stood. She stood there for her child. That was everything. It was enough.